Welcome to this video in which I will discuss the connection between the ego and the unconscious in Carl Jung. So this is a video on, I would say, philosophy of psychoanalysis from the perspective of Carl Jung. And the connection of the ego and the unconscious is quite different in Jung than it is in Freud. So remember, Freud and after him Lacan had a concept of the connection between the ego and the unconscious, and especially the unconscious, that was related to repression, childhood trauma. It was related to, it had a certain structure. Lacan coined the term, the unconscious structure like language. For Jung, these matters are quite different. His view, in fact, of what the Freudian school would call unconscious would be, and I will carry this forward as a hypothesis throughout this brief talk, his view on this would be that these repressed contents, they would still be part of the ego structure. Essentially, for Jung, especially if you read him with a more philosophically open mind, and not in the strict clinical sense of as some people tend to understand him and as he himself tended to portray himself, especially in his earlier writings. So if you avoid a, let's say, closed-minded reading of Jung and allow for more philosophical, maybe metaphysical, even some scholars suggest reading, you will see that what the Freudian school talks about as the unconscious, for Jung really isn't the unconscious. That would be part of the ego, and therefore not unconscious proper, so to speak. So let's begin then with the ego, because that's really where everything is centered. For Jung, the ego has to be thought of as a web of associations centered around a certain axiom. So you have an axis, and you could think of it as, the center of a village, and around that axis you have certain nodes. You could think of these as the houses of the village, organized in a certain way. Streets are connecting them. Some streets are bigger, some streets are smaller. And in between these nodes, you have communication in the form of people that are walking between these houses. And so you have a center place and sub-centers. And they form together a structure that is determined by its centerpiece. And the reason you can think of is, for instance, that in a town that centerpiece may be the town hall, where everything is organized, where people are told where they should go, goods are organized and distributed between the houses, perhaps even, the houses are constructed, funds are being allocated, and so on and so forth. So this is really a centralized structure on the one hand, that on the other hand functions in a decentralized manner. So what I mean by that is that in the ego you have certain core assumptions or core principles that govern its self-understanding, while on the other hand you maintain certain autonomy of components within that structure, and those components also feed into the self-understanding of the whole, be it by virtue of their presence, so by virtue of what they deliver, let's say, to the town hall, so that it can be reallocated, or by virtue of their absence, so by virtue of the fact that they don't deliver anything, but they still need to be delivered something. For example, just making up this metaphor on the spot, I hope it makes any sense. And third way, of course, is by virtue of their connection, so that there's a certain dependence and a certain interaction between these different segments. These houses, okay, let's stay with this centralized place first. The conception or the self-conception of the ego has to hang together for Jung. It's a certain, the goal or the logic by which the ego functions is continuity, linearity, and coherence. And that is not to say necessarily that the ego as a whole is coherent or continuous. But it is to say that from the perspective of the narrator, which is the dominant, the ego dominant, the dominant component of that ego at that moment in time, you could say the mayor of the town, for that matter. So for that narrator, a certain continuous structure is created. Okay? And again, you see that although different components may not hang together, they're assembled in a certain, by a certain logic in order to make sense in this continuity. And this continuity, as a consequence of this process of assemblage, is really what we can think of the Jungian ego. And this process subjugates the discontinuity that's actually below it. And now, note that this is all part of ego consciousness. Let's get to consciousness in a second. This is all part of the ego structure that we're speaking about here. And here, okay, we can then also get to an understanding of what we call consciousness, and as opposed to the unconscious in the Jungian understanding. And we can then also get to why let's call it in the larger sense, Freudian or Lacanian unconscious is for Jung simply that's just part of the ego structure, and has its role in there. And then we can get to what the unconscious actually means in this video or another one. Let's see how long I can keep going. So, one axiom of what we can call consciousness we have already established. It is the fact that in order for something to be conscious, it has to be inside this web that we just described, in which different aspects of reality, let's remain with that term for the moment. You could say different aspects of the material that can be knitted together are knit together. In order for that to happen, you must have a certain relationship to these elements. And that means you must have, or the individual must have encountered them at some moment in time. So you can't include something in the structure of your ego, of your identity, and I'll use those terms, ego and identity, interchangeably for reasons I'll get to, perhaps not in this tonight, but another time. But you will have to have encountered in one way or another these contents. This encounter does not necessarily have to be, life-changing. It doesn't have to, it's not what I call encounter in the usual sense. It's what in a later video perhaps, or whatever, or in other stuff that I've written, I call positive judgment. That is, I differentiate between positive and negative judgment, or positive and negative encounter. and a positive encounter being something that doesn't go against the continuous structure of the current ego dominant, so it doesn't disrupt or rupture the network that we've spoken about to an extent that momentarily subjugates its stability, okay? But in any case, for something to be part of consciousness for Jung, it has to be a part of a structure, a firmly knit network, somehow be integrated in there. Could be a person that lives there that doesn't play a major role, but is still in there. It has to be represented or reflected. So it's not only part of that structure, it's not only entailed in that greater narrative under that header, you know, that town hall, but it's also in itself represented, which already implies that it retains its own autonomy to a certain extent. And there is a possibility for making it, let's say, manipulating it, or not necessarily manipulating it as in you can fully control it, but you could make it, and now I'm using the colloquial term, phenomenologically conscious, by which I mean you can think of it basically, or you can call it into your mind. You know, you can, you know, even if I forgot a word, I don't know, like a minute ago I didn't think of, I don't know, the word bamboo or whatever, and now I can recall what a bamboo looks like, and it has no significance for my personality, or sorry, my identity right now. It may have some significance that I don't know of, but I can explore that position within this web that I then call my identity or my ego structure. So we've established roughly what we understand by consciousness in Jungian terms. It's different, from phenomenal consciousness, that is to say something I'm aware of. Okay, so for Jung, consciousness goes beyond mere awareness in neuroscience. Like in neuroscience, you would say something is not conscious. For example, if you flash images at your to your eyes, you flash images very rapidly so that they're subconscious. They still may exercise a certain influence on you. You know, you still may make a certain choice based on those encounters you had previously, although you can consciously, you're not aware of them. And you may be able to eventually recall them or not, and so it's a bit of a debate. This place of subconsciousness I'll get to in another video. But again, like for Jung, it's important. It's not necessarily important that you're aware of the position, the role, the relevance in a certain moment of time, but that position exists within the structure that is key to what we call consciousness. Okay, let's then get to what we call the unconscious in Jung. I have some notes here, so I'm just going to take a couple seconds too. Yeah, this is an important point, perhaps. Linking back the differentiation between the conscious and the unconscious components of the mind in Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis to this new definition of Jungian conscious and unconscious minds. For Jung, the psychoanalysis in the Freudian sense is purely on the level, remains on the level of consciousness. It's a process of restructuring, as it were, the village structure that you have. you change the weights of the individual units within within the network that makes up the entire village. And look, again, this may lead to the 360-degree change or 180-degree change of the individual, of the identity. So somebody can change, as it were, through psychoanalysis. But that is not what Jung understands as the unconscious. And to get to what we then understand as the unconscious in Jungian terms, and that's my reading of Jung, and people would disagree, I'm sure, but is a surprise. Everything that is not part of that structure. So everything that's not in that village is unconscious. Now that entails multiple components. On the one hand, it entails other people that I have nothing to do with. On the other hand, it entails places, it entails developments in the social realm, in the political realm, things that I simply don't know. But for Jung, it also entails something very key, and that is the self. And let's talk about that for a moment. The self is something bizarre, you know, for psychoanalysts and, you know, laymen alike. It's sort of a point of hope, a point of debate. People say it's a destiny, you know, it's something you arrive at, it's something you curate, something you can develop, something that unfolds in time. Sometimes people speak of it in passive language, as in, you know, you just have to discover it. Sorry, no, it will announce itself, something like that. And other people in active language, as in you just have to go out and discover it. But I would simply define it or understand it like that. So first of all, what we have to make sure to know is that anything that operates on the level of content, on the level of awareness, on the level of recall, is necessarily part of consciousness, right? So really, for the subject in daily life, so for you know, the me or you as minds, particulars, there is nothing but consciousness in our experience as conscious minds, okay? That doesn't mean that nothing else exists. It simply means that when I'm standing here talking, you know, to myself, there is, like, the unconscious exists, but I cannot experience it directly. For the moment I experience it, it's conscious, right? And the moment I recall, it's already part of the narrative that we then call the ego, because that's exactly how the mind, according to Jung at least, functions. You know, if you talk about something, language, you know, structured thinking are defined by the property that they are, you know, conscious, that is, somehow integrated into your identity. You know, the words that I'm saying here somehow make sense. Okay, that is also why psychoanalysis, to a certain degree, you know, to most degrees, is a conscious activity. It's an activity focused on consciousness, just as everything ultimately in life is, right? You can't really be alive as a human, at least as we understand life, being alive, without being conscious, right? It doesn't work. And I'm sorry, I'm loosely using the definitions of life here. I should be very particular and defining what I mean by life, but I'm not. I guess we all have it, you know, I mean not dead. So anyways, if that helped, but if that's very interesting and we should talk about death and life and all that, then you can leave a comment. I guess I'm trying to be very interactive. But in any case, if we speak about the self, then what we have to remember is that it cannot be, drop my pen, that it cannot be some numinous destiny somewhere in the far distance that we can walk to and grab or catch, as it were. You know, a popular self-proclaimed Jungian compared the self to something you can catch. That's very difficult, in my opinion. Anyways, so I think that is the first building block to this, to try and understand this really the most, I think, contested concept in Jungian psychoanalysis. It was the most critiqued by Lacanians. Okay, so if it cannot be something that remains unconscious, and note that I'm speaking about the self not as an archetype. We will get to archetypes in another video. Yeah, that's great. You can always put off these things by saying we'll get to it in another video. We'll talk about archetypes in another video when we speak about other aspects of the unconscious. They're, as it were, they're aspects of the as the material, you know, as psyche, as the material of the soul or of the mind. Okay, we won't talk about that today, or now, whatever. You can binge all the videos. But the self from the perspective of its application to the individual, so to one person, so not as a general property of the collective unconscious, which we'll also get to, but as, you know, what happens to that self as a, you know, as whatever it is, we'll get to it in a second, from the perspective of the ego structure that we just spoke about. And here comes a very important point, which I think pertains, and I think this is the best way to explain the unconscious and its effect, at least on that level. If we don't go to its, you know, sort of the level of the archetypes and sort of the structuring, the pre-structuring elements, and, you know, the sort of topics like the soul, very wild things. God, I said things. I don't like saying things, so just FYI. But so I'm specific. So the self, as it were, is perceived by Jungian scholars as destiny of the ego. So remember how I said that there's the central axiom, and that central axiom determines the conscious dominant of the entire structure of the ego. It determines the narrative that the entire convolute understands itself as, and thereby structures the layout of the entire network. Okay? So the self, apparently, according to these people, is the truth, the capital T, of this conscious dominant. Although then some say it's unconscious, whatever. It is thus the destiny of the individual self-development and unfolding. Okay, so how does that work? What happens, and this is my proposition, what happens is that the structure that is built in ego consciousness is built upon certain assumptions that are held to create the coherence of the entire narrative that holds together that structure. Okay? Those are assumptions, just as when you write a paper, you make assumptions, right? those assumptions are based on and integrated within the external world. That is to say, especially, and I think exclusively, although I'm not 100% sure, I'll anticipate this, I'll have to make up my mind, but I think exclusively, perhaps specifically, by virtue of other people. So other people possessing consciousness that have interacted with me. So my linearity, other person's linearity, intersection, they mutually arise, okay? What happens now is that the conscious dominant, so the dominant narratological, as it were, agent within my own conscious assumption ignores some of these encounters. But at certain moments in time, those will become relevant. Either because I re-encounter that person, or because something within, and this is important, something within the network that determines my ego consciousness as a whole changes the weights between these different units somehow change, so that suddenly there's a rearrangement of the elements in relationship to the general narrative that governs the structure. In other words, it may happen that the structure breaks down, and then in order to rebuild that structure, okay, you have to establish a new narrative, because remember, in order to be a conscious and thus a functioning being, okay, I wouldn't want to say human being, because human is, I don't know if that is particular to humans yet. We'll get to that in another video. And I'm not saying that, animals have personalities. And for Jung, it's not so clear in Jung that he thinks consciousness is a property exclusively limited in potentia, although in unfolding it is, but in potentia to humans, right? Okay. But after this rupture, be it bigger or smaller, that is caused somehow by something that challenges an assumption within the ego. And now it's important. This something that challenges this assumption can come from within itself. It can also come from outside. In any case, though, it is initiated external to it. So it is not, the ego within itself, within its structure, for Jung, is a relatively stable entity. If it was left alone, it would be stable, because that's its natural inclination. Its inclination is to create that fixed, stable web of, narrated assumptions that are put into a coherent story, as it were, network, that although they're very different, they're all forced under this coherence. And now something has to happen from the outside. Something has to break this force. And the reason why it's not inside is that although all these entities have the propensity to come up, again, within themselves, and thereby I say from their perspective, they're stable because they have this inclination for stability. And I'm not saying that someone else has to come in to me as a person, like another human has to now open this door and then rupture me, whatever. But it has to be something emerging. That is something, and here now comes in the unconscious, something that is not integrated in that structure.